All right, well, this is week 2 update for fall semester of 2024. Thank you for following along. Just to give you some updates on what we've been learning in my interfaith leadership class, we've been taking time to understand what does it mean to be interfaith. So the definition of interfaith, that term means if you are looking at your religion and thinking, what are some of the values of my religion that can be common with other religions out there? So how can we learn to work together better, basically, is what that talks about. Excuse me. So this is a new trend. It's probably over the last 20 years, interfaith leadership has been something that's been growing nationwide, well, internationally, I should say. So there's a training that we go through, I talked about last week, that is just talking about how can we start to think about people of different religious backgrounds learning to come together for a common good. So like an example would be maybe a Christian and an Islamic group coming together to raise money or to do a food drive for the local community food pantry. So it's not so much this idea of how can we get two religions to get along with each other. That can be interfaith to an extent, but also along with that idea of having dialogue with other religions and learning to resolve differences and those things, but also how can two religions come together to do things in their community to better the community. So if it's like an Islamic country, how can Christian religions actually work with the Islamic nations to better the economy or help the poor in that nation? That could be an interfaith discussion as well. So that's what we've been talking about. And if you're hearing, there's a little bit of construction in the background. We actually finally getting our house back together after the flood 2 months ago. So we're under construction. So we're probably gonna, another week or two, we're gonna have to move these bookshelves out. I'm gonna have to do my videos somewhere else other than my office for a week or two. For my Mormonism and early American history, this week we spent a lot of time talking about more the beginning of America. So the concepts of market forces, of when America came around, a couple things were really important to the development of America. One was a more open economy. So the colonies were actually allowed to print their own money and allowed to do their own exchanges and kind of grow on their own. And some of them grew very conservatively and others grew really fast. The ones that grew fast oftentimes ran into a recession sooner than the other ones. But as the country went into this idea of free markets, we want to open up competition, make it easy for local businesses to compete with companies from England coming over and so forth. And so they wanted to do more, development, growth, build their own economy in America rather than rely on foreign nations for imports to their economy. So one thing that happened in America was this idea that in the South, they would grow cotton. That cotton would be shipped to the North. The North would then have all the manufacturing plants for textiles to make that cotton into materials that could be used for like clothing and other things like that. And then the West, and when I say West, I'm talking like Ohio, Iowa, that like Oklahoma, Nebraska, that was the West in the early 1800s. Everything west of that was still outside the U.S. So this is shortly after the Louisiana Purchase time frame. But the West would do more agricultural things, so food products and other things. And these three parts of America would basically do trade with each other and thus keep an internal economy running for America. So during this time as well, this concept of free market started to emerge because in the US Constitution, after it was put in place, the idea of religious freedom would come around. One of the problems that was happening was Protestantism was very popular in the early days of America. And as most of the people who are government officials were Protestant. In some areas, like in Virginia, it was Anglicans, so they were a little bit more on the Catholic side of things. But the Anglicans had a lot of control in Virginia. as Virginia began as a state. So it was when after it switched from a colony to a state. But the challenge is the Baptists, basically, so more of the Protestant groups were realizing that Anglican philosophy was being taught in school. And they wanted to have Protestant philosophy taught in school. And so they basically pushed, the Baptists actually were persecuted because they were a different religion than Anglicans. And so that was part of the encouragement to vote for for the Constitution to have freedom of religion. What was interesting, though, is when the U.S. Constitution was created, they did not put freedom of religion inside the Constitution as its original document. So freedom of religion came in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which was done by the first Congress. So after the Constitution got put in place, Congress was formed. In that first session of Congress, they passed the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and that was freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And so that's how freedom of religion got in, because they said, hey, we don't want state-sponsored stuff, because the state of Virginia was actually funding Anglican churches, which was more of a Catholicism type idea versus Protestantism. The Protestants said, that's unfair for us. We're being persecuted and put in jail, and our churches are being shut down, and our priests are being imprisoned because we're a different religion than the Anglicans. And so they says, we want to change that. And so to make it fair, they said, all right, we're just going to say the states don't sponsor any religious organizations at all. So that changed how schools were funded and how everything worked, but it also allowed for religious freedom. So when religious freedom started to take off, we had what's known as the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. The Second Great Awakening was this idea that religion started to flourish. So we had, in the more established parts of America, regular churches, people going to church, doing their thing. It was a little bit more Catholic on that area. But as you get further into the West, into the pioneer areas, there wasn't many churches. So the idea of evangelicalism started to take hold and move. Charismatic preachers started going out doing these camp meetings out in the West, where they would set up a camp and get people to come in, and they would listen to a preacher preach. These ideas of these camp meetings, this more evangelical, feel the Spirit, get into the moment of it, is where the Methodists really took off and did really, really well through what was then the West, basically Nebraska, Iowa, those kinds of areas. Methodism did really well with these camp meetings, these revival type ideas. Other Protestant groups started to come in. And it was interesting because since there's no state-sponsored religions, the priests, these ministers, couldn't rely on government subsidies to help them. The government wasn't sponsoring the churches or helping to subsidize churches. And so they had to compete for members and then get their members to donate money to them to keep them going. So this idea of free market started to converge with religion. And that's where we get this big diversity of religion starting to emerge and take off. And so priests are competing with other priests to get followers so that they can grow their church. So if you think of the church from a business standpoint, that was some of the things that were going on with it. This was, and this is important to understand, because this is the time that Joseph Smith emerges. He is raised in this idea of the Second Great Awakening. There's this big revival, lots of churches, lots of opportunities to hear different versions of Christianity, different flavors of it that were out there. Excuse me. This is the time frame that Joseph Smith grew up in. And so some people would say that he is a product of this, that the Mormon church emerged out of the Second Great Awakening of this religious freedom opportunity as well. I think most members probably don't see it that way. But when you look at the idea of religions, you have to realize that what motivated Joseph Smith to pray and go to the grove, that sacred grove area, and pray about which church to join, was because there were so many of them out there. There were so many competing philosophies and ideas. He was confused as to which one was the right one to go to, because the Bible talks about a correct church. And so he didn't know what to do. And that because there were so many options, he kind of got stuck, that analysis paralysis. And so he says, I'm going to, he read James 1:5 and said, I'm going to go pray and ask God. And then the first vision happened. So in a way, Joseph and the result with the first vision and everything else is a bit of a byproduct of the Second Great Awakening. So that was what was happening about the time that Joseph Smith experienced the things he did as well. So it was some good background to just kind of see what was America like at that time, just before Joseph had his first vision and started down that path, basically. So it was really fun. My master's class, so the book we read this last week is Perpetua's Journey. I know the letters are probably flipped around, unfortunately. This is a book, it's a really good book, not very big. It's actually, part of it is a graphic novel, basically. And then there's some more text back here from historical backgrounds and things. So Perpetua was a well-educated woman, part of a noble family in Carthage. Now, not Carthage, Illinois, Carthage, North Africa. So where Tunisia is today, right? The north of Africa, so not far from like Sicily and things on the other side of the Mediterranean from Italy area, basically, where ancient Phoenicia used to be as well. When Rome took it over, it was Carthage, a very important port along the southern Mediterranean, or North Africa, whichever way you look at it. So she's a part of a well-to-do family, and she converts to Christianity. Well, at this time, of course, in the Roman culture, so she was probably born late 100s, maybe somewhere in the 190s AD, maybe 188 AD type frame, because she's an adult woman around 210, 212 time frame when all this starts to happen, early 3rd century. So she's raised in a Roman family, basically. So she'd be considered a Gentile from a Jewish perspective. Christianity comes into the area. She converts. She believes in Christ and his teachings and converts to Christianity. But at the time in Rome, so religion and state were the exact same thing. For Rome, it was the same thing for the Babylonian Empire, Assyrian Empire, Jewish communities. For centuries, the idea of a separation of church and state was not heard of. Your state and your religion was the exact same thing. So in Rome, the state religion was somewhat polytheistic. You might think, well, then why were they so worried about Christ? If they believed in any God, like if you look in the New Testament, Paul went and spoke on Mars Hill at the Parthenon, where they had idols to all the gods and even to the unknown God, in case there was a God they didn't account for. While they were polytheistic in their philosophy, the problem was the main god was the emperor. And so they had an emperor worship. So you had to offer an animal sacrifice or some kind of an oblation like that to the emperor to show obeisance to him. Well, the Christians believe that's idol worship, that's paganism, and that's against Christianity. And so the Christians wouldn't do the oblations. In fact, if the problem was if the Christians didn't do the oblations, they were put in jail and executed. And so some Christians says, well, we'll do the obligation just to go through the motion so we don't die. They were sometimes at a later date seen as not Christian anymore, or less than Christian, weren't totally worthy because they were willing to go through the motions of this pagan worship. So that turned into a whole other debate a couple centuries later. I guess maybe almost a century later. But anyways, the story is Perpetua and a slave, Felicity, that's a friend of hers. They join Christianity. They refuse to renounce Christianity and worship the emperor. And so they get put in jail, and her dad tries numerous times to get her to renounce her Christianity and come back and live the way the law says they should live in Roman times, but she won't. So she and Felicity and others who refuse to give up their Christianity are sent to the games. Now, what that means is they went to the Colosseum, they were brought out into the Colosseum, and then wild beasts were let loose into the Colosseum, and they had to deal with these wild beasts. So, wild boars, one was a bear that mauled one guy, another was a leopard that took out somebody else, and they were mauled basically. Not all of them died, and then they brought them back out after they're done with the games, and then just cut all their heads off. So if you didn't die by the animal, then they're going to cut your head off anyways. So that was their execution. And this is her journey through this whole experience, and she has visions and sees heavens and sees other things. So she's kind of a prophetess to an extent. Some people wonder if she was a Montanist. Montanism was a version of Christianity in the early days that really believed a lot in modern day prophecy, as well as, well, modern day for their days prophecy, as well as women could hold priesthood just equally with men and everything else. So some people say maybe she was a Montanist, part of a version of Christianity. But it was a good book. It's a really good book. And if you notice, there's a lot, the subscript here, faith, gender, and power in the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of contrast in here about being a woman and a Christian, and then dealing with power from her dad trying to convince her to stop being Christian to save her life, as well as what the Roman Empire is doing against her and how they treat her and things like that. It's really it's a good book. It's a good book because of there's a graphic novel section here. That was part of her dreams right there. In fact, some of her visions and things. It's pretty accessible to the average person. So if you're interested in learning more about early martyrdom in Christianity, this is a popular one to look at. So Perpetua's Journey, I think it was like $10 on Amazon or something. So if you want something about that, that was a good book to read. So well worth getting involved with. So thanks for watching the update. We're going to have another book next week. I've just started it. It's called The Cheese and the Worms. If you wanted to look it up and see more about it, it's about the Italian Inquisition. So we're going to bring that up next week, and we'll see you then.